The Big People in Can You Forgive Her by Anthony Trollope. One of the themes of this novel is undoubtedly the hereditary power held by the ruling class. The ruling class of the country at this time was really the landowning class for the most part, the aristocracy and the landed gentry. To some extent as well, the descendants of the gentry, people who perhaps had no great land holdings but who were in possession of private incomes and who might be in possession of smaller country houses with sort of large gardens of some acres but not massive farms, or perhaps those people who were mainly resident in cities but who had private income behind them because they were descended from landed families. To some extent, of course, the new industrial class of entrepreneurs and industrial magnates was up and coming, but they weren't really the mainstream group as yet. Trollope was fascinated by the parliamentary system. He tried himself to enter Parliament, and he was in favour of this style of government. He was in favour of power belonging to a hereditary class. He says of his character Plantagenet Palliser, Plantagenet Palliser, I think, to be a very noble gentleman, such a one as justifies to the nation the seeming anomaly of an hereditary peerage and of primogeniture. So primogeniture, of course, the custom of the eldest son inheriting everything, the eldest son in the winner-takes-all type of syndrome. All of that having been said, Trollope did concede that there were some flaws within the system. He says, at another point, I have endeavoured to depict the faults and frailties and vices, as also the virtues, the graces, and the strength of our highest classes. And if I have not made the strengths and virtues predominant over the faults and vices, I have not painted the picture as I intended. So, whilst he acknowledges some shortcomings, nonetheless, overall, he thinks this is a very good system. Political characters were sometimes Trollope's mouthpiece. How frequently I have used them for the expression of my political and social convictions. This, though, is a system of government which is characterised by the exclusion of vast swathes of the population. As I mentioned in the introduction, it wasn't possible to become a member of Parliament at this time without having very large sums of money behind one to back up the campaign. It's probably not necessary to point out, but I will anyway, that the only people who could campaign to become members of Parliament were in any case, of course, men. Women were just totally excluded from the whole system. But without property, individuals were not able to vote at this period. And as I say, actually entering government was really only open to those who were rich or who had vast funds made available to them by some means. This means that even within the ruling class itself, there were strong distinctions of the levels of personal power and the levels of personal sway that individuals held. Although Plantagenet Palliser is wealthy in terms of the house and lands and property that he will inherit, and he lives in probably grace and favour property of Matching Priory, which is a large estate, because he hasn't yet inherited the main title. So although he will come into vast swathes of land and property, and already lives within and quite probably receives the rents and incomes from the estate that he lives in. This is not the readily convertible cash that he needs in order to mount a campaign to enter the Houses of Parliament, in order to live at a certain level of social interaction, social fashionability, social prominence that he needs in order to rise through the political ranks. And he is a very, very ambitious man. So he has married Glencora McCluskey in order to be able to make use of her inheritance, her money, her fortune, to assist him in this process. Plantagenet Palliser seems to have a natural magnetism for the political key players amongst whom he finds himself. He obviously has very strong intellect and considerable grasp of finances and the way in which finance works. He's a clever man. But I think there is something about his personality which also marks him out as a politician in the eyes of those who already have the influence and the power. For those like Plantagenet Palliser who are in the position of supreme privilege, the assumption of power is a fairly seamless process. And this passage in chapter 33, entitled Monkshade, the name of the country home of the aristocratic Monks family, helps to illustrate that. Mr. Palliser remained 3 days at Monkshade and cemented his political alliance with Sir Cosmo much in the same way as he had before done with the Duke of St. Bungay. There was little or nothing said about politics, and certainly not a word that could be taken as any definite party understanding between the men. But they sat at dinner together at the same table, drank a glass of wine or two out of the same decanters, and dropped a chance word now and again about the next session of Parliament. I do not know that anything more had been expected either by Mr. Palliser or by Sir Cosmo, but it seemed to be understood when Mr. Palliser went away that Sir Cosmo was of opinion that the young scion of a ducal house ought to become the future Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Whig government. So there's really no suggestion of a meritocracy here. The range of people under consideration for the role of Chancellor of the Exchequer is extremely narrow, and of course it's set by social position. There isn't either any discussion of how well qualified Plantagenet Palliser is for the role of Chancellor of Exchequer. Although he is politically quite a brilliant man, others do comment that he doesn't really have any fiscal experience, but that's not seen as a disadvantage at all. In fact, it's regarded as perhaps an advantage. It might be said today that the role of Chancellor of the Exchequer does not necessarily go to people with degrees in economics, but I suppose at least people assuming that role within British government today will have quite a long-term experience of working within politics at least. There's an unspoken recognition between the two men that they are of the same social group, the same social level, that they will conduct themselves in all affairs according to certain codes and principles that belong to the gentleman class. If they like one another well enough, it's really a foregone conclusion that Plantagenet Palliser will take on the role of Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's just simply a question of the extent to which you fit in as being the right type of person amongst the right type of people. It's the people like us syndrome. Given the very codified, very dignified, very establishment and ordered way in which Plantagenet Palliser fits in so seamlessly to the world of public affairs, it's not surprising that he finds it particularly hard to engage in his relationship with Glencora, who is quite the reverse. She's a free spirit. She's extremely feminine. She doesn't necessarily agree that there are preset or preconceived codes and modes of behaviour for specific circumstances. And she and Plantagenet Palliser are fundamentally, temperamentally, not terribly well suited to one another. But the contrast, of course, is very amusing throughout the course of the novel. So, some people, by dint of primogeniture, find themselves in an advantageous position within the system. Some people may come from families that mean they have a private fortune, and they will be able to fund themselves into government jobs or parliamentary positions or positions that in some way are part of the administration of government. They may not need much of an income. These jobs tended not to have much of an income, and they may be able to work their way up through the ranks, therefore, and to assume levels of power that may ultimately earn them a title so that they themselves enter the aristocracy. This is how it worked. But there are also those people who appear to be heavily disadvantaged within the system, and those are especially the younger sons. And the younger sons, or in particular the second sons. We see two of these cases in this novel. In fact, we see three. We see Alice Vavasor's father, John Vavasor, whose elder brother should have inherited the family land and estates. However, the brother has died, and it's George Vavasor who is in line to inherit the estate. So, in the meantime, John Vavasor, who is full of a sense of his own importance because of the long-established family from which he comes, is reduced to the indignity of having to actually earn a living of some kind. He does take this very hard, despite the fact that the living that he is able to earn quite easily requires very little effort and very little time from him. 2 years after his wife's death, Mr. Vavasor was appointed Assistant Commissioner in some office which had to do with insolvents, and which was abolished 3 years after his appointment. It was at first thought that he would keep his 800 a year for life and be required to do nothing for it, but a wretched cheese-paring Whig government, as John Vavasor called it when describing the circumstances of the arrangement to his father down in Westmoreland, would not permit this. It gave him the option of taking 400 a year for doing nothing, or of keeping his whole income and attending 3 days a week for 3 hours a day during term time at a miserable, dingy little office near Chancery Lane, where his duty would consist in signing his name to documents which he never read, and at which he was never supposed even to look. He had sulkily elected to keep the money, and this signing had now been for nearly 20 years the business of his life. Of course, he considered himself to be a very hardly used man. One Lord Chancellor after another he petitioned, begging that he might be relieved from the cruelty of his position and allowed to take his salary without doing anything in return for it. The amount of work which he did perform was certainly a minimum of labour. Term time, as terms were counted in Mr. Vavasor's office, hardly comprised half the year, and the hours of weekly attendance did not do more than make 1 day's work a week for a working man. But Mr. Vavasor had been appointed an assistant commissioner, and with every Lord Chancellor he argued that all Westminster Hall and Lincoln's Inn to boot had no right to call upon him to degrade himself by signing his name to accounts. In answer to every memorial he was offered the alternative for freedom with half his income, and so the thing went on. So there's this sense of being privileged, this sense of being somehow born to the right to live as a gentleman and to simply be provided, as the birds in a sense are provided for, to live as a gentleman. And this so a sense of entitlement, really, in other words, and the sense of indignity that's associated with having to work at all. In fact, it's a very, very privileged position that he's in. £800 per annum was not an inconsiderable income for the period. It wasn't riches in terms of being upper middle class by any manner of means, but it would certainly have been riches for the average factory labourer, untold riches. So there's an anomaly here, and it's not an attractive one. We see another second son in the person of Burgo Fitzgerald. Again, there are quite strong anomalies in the character of Burgo Fitzgerald. He is inordinately beautiful, seemingly breathtakingly beautiful to look at physically. Wherever he goes, he turns everybody's head. And yet, Burgo Fitzgerald is absolutely beset by the sense of self-doubt and a sense of absolute worthlessness. He is not the chosen one, he's not the elected one, he will inherit nothing from his family, yet he feels himself to be in a position he hasn't been particularly trained to take up a career or a position. And again, as with John Vavasor, he is constricted by this sense of privilege, the sense of being a gentleman, and that, again, being a gentleman is something that simply the laws of fate should somehow support. But of course they don't. But he is wandering, he is drifting. He is aware of a sense of, he has a strong sense of pointlessness to his existence, and is drifting into alcoholism. He drifts as well into an obsessional quest to possess Glencora, whom he was in love with, but perhaps his love was also influenced by her fortune, and even his quest to obtain her and to possess her by causing her to desert her husband is underpinned by a belief that Plantagenet Palliser will release to Glencora a certain proportion at least of her vast fortune to support her in a life with Burgo Fitzgerald. He is not insincere, but he is in a sense manipulated by his own sense of how he perceives the world and life to be because of the position into which he's been born. Burgo Fitzgerald doesn't seem to see a difference between the straitened circumstances that he finds himself in through his own fecklessness and own lack of decision to undertake consistent and systematic work and employment, which he would have connections enough to be able to find. He doesn't see any difference between his abandoned situation and the situation of absolute destitution that a young prostitute whom he meets in the streets is facing. She has virtually no clothes, she is extremely hungry, it's cold, she has no home, no place, no sheltered place in which even to sleep. And this situation comes about because she is powerless. She is absolutely powerless. She has no rich connections. She's got no starting point in life. But Burgo Fitzgerald really is so disconnected from what he has because of the perception of what he hasn't by comparison with the primogenitor within his social group, that he just actually doesn't see a difference. We see as well in Geoffrey Palliser not a second son, but the son of a second son of the Duke of Omnium. His father held a position within government and managed pretty well. But after his father's death, Geoffrey has a small private income of £600 per annum. It certainly will support him and enables him to live quite reasonably comfortably enough, but definitely not to keep up with those people who are in possessions of land and power. So Geoffrey it's quite a telling conversation that Geoffrey has with Plantagenet Palliser about his future. Geoffrey really has got no idea of what he's going to do. He feels that he should do something, but it's just this idea not that he must do something, but that he ought to do something. He's really at a loss, he's really at a loose end, because he hasn't got an estate to inherit, he hasn't got a title to inherit, he hasn't got any hereditary power into which to come. And this is one of the real shortcomings of this social group at the period. Unless you were right at the top of the tree, then you were ruthlessly almost abandoned. Everything was sacrificed to the eldest son. Everything was sacrificed to the continuation of the status and executive power of the family. And that went down through the eldest son exclusively. So Geoffrey is 26 at this time, and it is a pity you should do nothing all your life, his cousin Plantagenet said to him one morning just at this time. Geoffrey had sought the interview in his cousin's room, and I fear had done so with some slight request for ready money. "What am I to do?" said Geoffrey. "At any rate you might marry." "Oh yes, I could marry. There's no man so poor but he can do that. The question would be how I might like the subsequent starvation." "I don't see that you need starve. Though your own fortune is small, it is something, and many girls have fortunes of their own." Geoffrey thought of Lady Glencora, but made no allusion to her in speech. "I don't think I'm very good at that kind of thing," he said. "When the father and mother came to ask of my house and my home, I should break down. I don't say it as praising myself, indeed quite the reverse, but I fear I have not a mercenary tendency." The conversation continues. "Would you like to occupy a farm in Scotland?" said Plantagenet Palliser. "And pay rent?" "You would have to pay rent, of course." "Thank you, no. It would be dishonest, as I know I should never pay it." "You are too old, I fear, for the public service." You mean a desk in the Treasury with 100 a year? Yes, I think I'm too old. But have you no plan of your own? Not much of one. Sometimes I've thought I would go to New Zealand. You would have to be a farmer there. No, I shouldn't do that. I should get up an opposition to the government and that sort of thing, and then they would buy me off and give me a place. That does very well here, Geoffrey, if a man can get into Parliament and has capital enough to wait, but I don't think it would do out there. Would you like to go into Parliament? What? Here? Of course I should, only I should be sure to get terribly into debt. I don't owe very much now, not to speak of, except what I owe you. You owe me nothing, said Plantagenet, with some little touch of magniloquence in his tone. The conversation doesn't develop much further in terms of what Geoffrey's going to do between him and Plantagenet, although he does leave the interview with a cheque for £500 in his pocket, which is quite a considerable amount of money. I mean, even now to be given a cheque for £500 to most people would seem like being given a cheque for quite a lot of money. In those days it would have gone a great deal further than it does today. It's an extraordinary amount of wealth that Plantagenet Palliser has at his fingertips, that he can afford to simply give his cousin a cheque for £500. The theme of what Geoffrey's going to do is continued, though, in the drawing room afterwards. Are you going to ride with us after lunch? Said Lady Glencora to him as he strolled into the drawing room. No, said Geoffrey, I'm going to study. To do what? Said Lady Glencora. To study, or rather, I shall spend today in sitting down and considering what I will study. My cousin has just been telling me that I ought to do something. So you ought, said Iphigenia energetically from her writing table. But he didn't seem to have any clear opinion what it ought to be. You see, there can't be two Chancellors of the Exchequer at the same time. Mrs. Sparks, what ought a man like me to set about doing? Go into Parliament, I should say, said Mrs. Sparks. Ah, yes, exactly. He had some notion of that kind too, but he didn't name any particular place. I think I'll try the City of London. They've 4 there, and of course the chance of getting in would thereby be doubled. I thought that commercial men were generally preferred in the city, said the Duchess, taking a strong and good-natured interest in the matter. Mr. Palliser means to make a fortune in trade as a preliminary, said Mrs. Sparks. I don't think he meant anything of the kind, said the Duchess. At any rate, I have to do something, so I can't go and ride, said Geoffrey. And you ought to do something, said Iphigenia from her desk. So I think that this conversation from really the lack of focus, the lack of defined objective, the lack of real intellectual application that's being brought to the issue of what Geoffrey is going to do is highly definitive of the syndrome that I've been talking about, the difficulty for those people who've been brought up in privilege, who've been brought up with the idea that the only really valid outcome for life is, to be the primogenitor. It's really producing people who are not, don't feel in command of their own destiny, don't feel in command of their own fate. And so we've got this issue for men, second sons and younger sons. We've got this issue for women as well. That was discussed in the introduction, how women in the governing class, what is their role, what is their position, what are they to do? The novel poses these 2 questions. What is a woman to do with her life? And by implication, the novel implies the question, what should a second son do with his life? Burgo Fitzgerald, in talking to his aunt, Lady Monks, at one point in the story when he's considering eloping with Glencora, talks about his lack of money and also his inability to earn a living. And I just quote that. It's from Preparations for Lady Monk's Party, chapter 48. Burgo was still looking at the fireplace, and he sat on, looking and still looking, but he said nothing. You can think of what I have said, Burgo, continued his aunt, meaning that he should get up and go. But he did not go. Have you anything more that you wish to say to me? She asked. I've got no money, said Burgo, still looking at the fireplace. Lady Glencora's property was worth not less than 50,000 a year. He was a young man ambitious of obtaining that almost incredible amount of wealth, and who once had nearly reached it by means of her love. His present obstacle consisted in his want of a £20 note. I've got no money. The words were growled out rather than spoken, and his eyes were never turned even for a moment towards his aunt's face. You've never got any money, said she, speaking almost with passion. How can I help it? I can't make money. If I had a couple of £100 so that I could take her, I believe that she would go with me. It should not be my fault if she did not. It would have been all right if she had come to Monkshade. I've got no money for you, Burgo. I have not £5 belonging to me. But you've got what? Said Lady Monk, interrupting him sharply. So we see here the sense of disempowerment that Burgo has towards finance. He has no perception, he has no conception of how money is made. And of course those people around him who possess money have not made the money. They've inherited the money, they've inherited the lands, they've inherited the investments that give them wealth. And because he's not in that supremely privileged position of being the primogenitor, he has become extremely discouraged. He's actually, I think, suffering from depression. And the sense of desperation and desolation, indeed, about how he can make anything of his life, how he can move forward, is all enveloping. It's absolutely engulfing, and it does go on to engulf him. It's perhaps not the worst bind to be caught up in, but I think often psychological barriers are really hard to break. If a person's not able to see, because those structures have been built into their psychology, the pillars that uphold the structure of their thinking, how can they escape from them? Burgo Fitzgerald's entire education, his entire world knowledge has been built up within the situation of privilege, within the world of privilege. And the classes were so much more segregated at this time. There was no real need for people who grow up in the sort of echelon where Burgo Fitzgerald is living, existing, moving as a shade through. There's no reason for them to particularly have to engage with or interact with people of other social groups. So they really didn't have the conception of how they would manage being outside of these structures that were built into their whole existence, part of the fabric of the meaning of their existence. I think in a way that it's difficult to understand nowadays. Of course the chivalric code had gone, but nevertheless the sense of belonging to a group with specific values and specific codes and specific ideals and a whole way of life and a whole way of thinking, deeply ensconced in the ideas of understatement and being self-contained and reserved, of being brave and courageous, but not in an overt way. It's very difficult to break out of. There is more personal freedom today across all levels of society than there was at this time. The whole issue of status is present quite pervasively, actually, in the novel. The novel opens in terms of discussing status. Whether or no she whom we are to forgive, if you can, did or did not belong to the upper 10,000 of this our English world, I am not prepared to say with any strength of affirmation. By blood, she was connected with big people, distantly connected with some very big people indeed. People who belonged to the upper 1000, if there be any such division. But of these very big relations she had known and seen little, and they had cared as little for her. Her grandfather, Squire Vavasor of Vavasor Hall in Westmoreland, was a country gentleman, possessing some 1,000 a year at the outside. And so it goes on. So Alice's status and the status of her family is established here. They have social status.